January 1916. Northern France. The ground is frozen solid, a crust of ice over endless mud. The wind cuts through the canvas tents like a blade. Along a shattered railway line near Ypres, exhausted British soldiers huddle around a flickering stove, steam rising from their damp uniforms. Somewhere beyond the gray mist, artillery murmurs, the constant heartbeat of the Western Front. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Nissen of the Royal Engineers trudges through the slush, his boots sinking deep into the sludge. He's seen too many men die, not from bullets, but from cold. Inside his coat pocket, a small notebook, sketches of curved lines, metal ribs, and mathematical angles. He studies a bent sheet of corrugated steel, bomb-scarred but unbroken. Its curve catches his eye. Half circle, perfect symmetry, strength through simplicity. That night, by candlelight in a wooden shed near Saint-Omer, Nissen begins to draw. Line by line, the idea takes form. A shelter light enough for 4 men to carry, strong enough to resist a shell blast, and simple enough to build anywhere. The Nissen Hut is born, forged in mud, necessity, and British ingenuity. By 1916, the First World War had turned Europe into a continent of ruins. Cities were skeletons of brick and ash. The Western Front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a maze of trenches, dugouts, and shattered villages. For every advance, 1,000 men froze, sickened, or died waiting for proper shelter that never came. Britain's Royal Engineers faced an impossible equation: build fast, build strong, and build everywhere. Traditional barracks and wooden huts were too slow, too resource-hungry, and too fragile. Timber was scarce. Transport was chaotic. Skilled builders were already fighting on the front lines. The army needed something new, a structure that could be built by untrained soldiers with minimal materials and survive the brutal European winter. That challenge fell upon a single mind: Lieutenant Colonel Peter Nissen, a mining engineer by trade and an inventor by instinct. Born in the United States to Norwegian parents and educated in Canada, Nissen carried an engineer's obsession with geometry and a soldier's respect for time. Every wasted hour cost lives. His early prototypes emerged in the summer of 1916, a series of arched shelters made from curved steel ribs, covered with corrugated iron sheets, bolted to a wooden frame. The genius lay in the curve. The semicircular shape distributed weight evenly, resisted wind, and deflected shrapnel. The design could be flat-packed, transported by truck or horse cart, and erected by a handful of men using little more than hand tools. The first tests were astonishing. A team of 6 Royal Engineers built one in under 4 hours. Its light frame survived bombardment and even snow load. Inside, a small coal stove could turn the freezing air into warmth. It wasn't luxury, but it was life-saving. By late 1916, orders poured in from across the British Expeditionary Force. Thousands of Nissen huts appeared along the front. Mess halls, hospitals, offices, even chapels. Soldiers described them as ugly but beautiful, the arching silhouette becoming as familiar as the sound of distant guns. Every rivet and bolt carried Nissen's mark of purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. The British Army had found its shelter: portable, resilient, democratic. But war evolves faster than invention. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the Nissen Hut outlived the trenches. Thousands were repurposed for refugees, field schools, and rural housing across Europe and the Empire. Yet the idea, that curve of steel simplicity, was far from finished. 20 years later, another war would need it again. As the 1930s darkened into global tension, militaries everywhere prepared for the unthinkable: another world war. Britain began rearming, but across the Atlantic, the United States watched and waited. confident in oceans, industry, and distance. That illusion would not last. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, America found itself at war on two fronts and facing a logistical nightmare on a scale the world had never seen. The U.S. Army needed not hundreds, but tens of thousands of buildings, barracks, hospitals, workshops, warehouses, and they needed them yesterday. In that crisis, American engineers looked across the Atlantic for inspiration. They found it in Nissen's design, the curved steel hut that had once sheltered men from Flanders' rain. But America would not just copy it, they would industrialize it. In early 1941, as the United States rushed to mobilize, the Navy established a new construction battalion, soon to be known as the Seabees. Their mission: build anything, anywhere, under fire if necessary. But they faced a staggering problem: how to house hundreds of thousands of men in every corner of the world, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific. At Quonset Point Naval Air Station, Rhode Island, a team of engineers from the George A. Fuller Company gathered around the blueprints of the British Nissen Hut. The War Department had acquired Nissen's patents years earlier, and now they sought to redesign it for American mass production. The original Nissen was efficient, but it was a British product of scarcity. Thin steel, tight angles, and handmade precision. The Americans wanted something faster, cheaper, and standardized. Their answer would become an icon of the U.S. war effort: the Quonset Hut. In February 1941, the first prototype rose on the Rhode Island coast. It shared the same familiar half-cylinder silhouette, but was distinctly American in construction. The frame was lighter, made of galvanized steel ribs, bolted to simple wooden floors. Instead of using curved corrugated sheets like Nissen's original, the Quonset employed flat panels pressed into shape by enormous machines, a product of Detroit's industrial muscle rather than the Royal Engineers' field ingenuity. Each unit could be packed into crates and shipped anywhere in the world. The first shipments went to Newfoundland and Iceland, where U.S. forces were preparing airfields under the Lend-Lease program. The test was successful. Production exploded. By the end of 1942, over 150,000 Quonset huts had been built. They spread across the Pacific Islands, North Africa, and eventually Western Europe. Each came in a wooden crate containing everything: bolts, panels, flooring, insulation, even the nails. 24 men could build one in less than a day. They became, in the words of one Seabee commander, the face of American logistics. Yet beneath the efficiency lay a fundamental difference. The Quonset Hut wasn't born from hardship like the Nissen. It was born from abundance. It reflected America's industrial philosophy: if one is good, build a million. It wasn't optimized for field conditions as much as for factory output. The result was both a triumph and a compromise. In the dry heat of California or the cool winds of Iceland, Quonset huts performed admirably. But in the Pacific's humidity, metal panels warped, interiors baked, and condensation dripped like rain from the ceiling. The simplicity that had worked for Britain's damp fields didn't translate perfectly to America's global battlefields. Still, they symbolized something greater: the logistical miracle of the U.S. war machine. From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, the half-moon huts dotted every landscape, becoming hospitals, command posts, radar stations, and chapels. For many soldiers, they were the only home they knew. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the original Nissen huts were still serving, quietly, efficiently, and often unnoticed. They stood in airfields, training camps, and prisoner-of-war compounds. The two designs, British and American, had the same ancestor but very different souls. The stage was set for a silent contest between two philosophies of war engineering: the elegance of necessity versus the power of mass production. And soon, that contrast would play out under fire. from the frozen airfields of England to the burning beaches of the Pacific. The engineering angle, curves of genius, the Nissen Hut's strength lay in its geometry. A perfect semicircle, 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, its arched steel ribs distributed load evenly across the structure. Every inch of curvature mattered. It was not just aesthetic, it was physics. The semicircular shell allowed rain and snow to slide off, wind to pass over smoothly, and pressure to equalize during nearby blasts. In a war where trenches collapsed and timber rotted, that curved shell endured. Each Nissen rib was made from lightweight steel, bent into precise arcs, joined by bolts, and covered with corrugated iron sheets that interlocked like scales. The interior was timber-lined for insulation, with simple floorboards and a small stove in the center. It could be dismantled and rebuilt repeatedly without tools beyond a wrench and hammer. By contrast, the Quonset Hut, while inspired by Nissen's design, had subtle but telling changes. The American engineers used a two-piece rib system with a shallower curve and wider radius. This made it easier to manufacture in bulk, but altered how the structure handled stress. The flat-pressed steel panels were cheaper and faster to produce, but they lacked the same tensile resilience as Britain's curved iron sheets. Even ventilation differed. Nissen's design relied on natural airflow through end vents and window placement, maintaining a balance between heat and moisture. The Quonset, standardized for shipping, sacrificed that fine-tuning. In tropical climates, condensation built up inside, dripping constantly, an irony that soldiers dubbed steel rain. Still, both designs represented ingenuity under pressure. The difference was one of philosophy. The British built for endurance. The Americans built for scale. 2. The logistics angle. Flat-pack warfare in both world wars, logistics won battles as surely as bullets did. And in logistics, the Nissen Hut and Quonset Hut were silent weapons. For the British Army, Nissen's design solved an existential problem. Each hut could be packed onto a single standard army wagon, its parts numbered and bundled. A small team could assemble one in less than 4 hours. No cranes, no electricity, no expert supervision. It turned the chaos of the front lines into something orderly. A commander could request 50 huts in a telegram and expect them standing within days. The U.S. military, however, operated on an entirely different scale. When America entered the war, they needed to build entire cities overnight. Airfields in the Pacific, naval bases in the Arctic, depots in the Sahara. The Quonset Hut became their universal building block. Factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania began producing them by the thousands. They were shipped in wooden crates, each labeled prefabricated housing unit, type NS1. Every part fit together like an industrial puzzle. Even untrained men could erect one, using the instruction booklet printed on waterproof paper. It was modular warfare at its peak. By mid-1943, Quonset Huts formed the skeleton of American logistics: sleeping quarters, hospitals, workshops, radio centers, and command offices. The Navy used them as warehouses and field laboratories. The Army used them for barracks and storage. Even the Red Cross converted them into canteens and theaters. But where the Nissen Hut's strength was its simplicity and adaptability, the Quonset's scale became its weakness. Flat steel panels corroded quickly in humid climates. Wooden floors warped in the tropics. The shallow curvature, ideal for stacking crates efficiently, collected heat like a furnace. Soldiers stationed in the Pacific would sometimes lift entire huts onto stilts or cut vents into the roof just to survive the midday heat. Still, the sight of their silver arcs became synonymous with the American advance, like a second army made of steel. In photographs of Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Leyte, they gleam in rows beside palm trees and aircraft, testimony to a civilization on the move. And yet, for all its brilliance, the Quonset could never quite capture what Nissen's hut achieved. balance. Nissen's creation was the product of constraint, designed to do more with less. The Quonset, born of abundance, did everything by doing too much. One was crafted for soldiers who built it in mud. The other for engineers who built it from factories. Both changed the face of warfare. But only one would be remembered as the original curve that shaped the modern battlefield. And as the war expanded, the huts themselves became symbols of two empires, one holding on to survival, the other surging into global dominance. The human angle, life beneath the curve, for the men who lived inside them, the huts were more than engineering, they were experience. In France, the Nissen Hut became the soldiers' only refuge from misery. Inside, the air smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Condensation beaded on the corrugated walls, hissing softly as it met the stove's heat. Wooden planks creaked under boots as letters were written home. Boots were dried, and tea was brewed from canteen tins. They were crude shelters, but compared to canvas tents or flooded dugouts, they were paradise. A single stove could warm an entire hut. A lantern at night made it feel like a room, not a bunker. Even generals noted how morale rose where Nissen huts stood. Men slept better, fought harder, and felt human again. The Americans experienced something similar, yet subtly different. In a Quonset hut on Guadalcanal or Saipan, the heat was suffocating by day, the air stale by night. Mosquitoes hummed, and sweat dripped from ceilings like rain. Still, those curved walls became their homes. Soldiers painted names on the doors, built makeshift porches, and carved slogans into the beams. For many, it was their first taste of community in war. It was a world under tin, one U.S. Marine recalled. You knew you weren't home, but it was better than the jungle. Both huts, Nissen and Quonset, became shared memories of endurance. They were not just structures. They were symbols of adaptation. They turned mud and chaos into something organized, something livable. The cultural and strategic angle. Britain's precision versus America's power. Every design tells a story about the people who made it. The Nissen Hut reflected Britain's wartime character, restrained, clever, built for necessity. It used minimal steel, no luxury materials, and could be repaired endlessly. The British Empire in 1916 was stretched thin, its resources and manpower drained. The Nissen Hut was an embodiment of that reality, a product of austerity that performed beyond expectation. In contrast, the Quonset Hut embodied the American approach to war: scale, speed, and standardization. It was not designed to be the best. It was designed to be everywhere. The U.S. could afford to trade refinement for volume, comfort for mobility. A Nissen Hut was a piece of field engineering. A Quonset Hut was an industrial product. The difference lay in purpose. The British hut was born for immediate survival, built where men froze and died. The American hut was born for global projection, built to follow armies across oceans. Even their aesthetics told different stories. The Nissen's narrow arch sat humbly against the landscape, blending into the mud and grass. The Quonset's broader dome looked industrial, almost futuristic, a reflection of America's belief in machinery as the future of civilization. Strategically, these structures represented the logistical philosophies of two empires. Britain's war machine relied on flexibility, smaller, adaptable units stationed across colonies and fronts. The Nissen Hut suited that mindset. Compact, portable, modular, America's war was one of production. The Quonset Hut fit perfectly within the arsenal of democracy, factories producing identical parts that could be assembled anywhere in the world. The cultural divide even reached beyond the battlefield. After the war, thousands of Quonset Huts were sold as surplus in the United States, turned into homes, workshops, and diners. They became a symbol of post-war America, the temporary building that refused to die. Meanwhile, in post-war Britain, the Nissen Hut quietly faded. Some became classrooms, chapels, or emergency housing during the Blitz recovery. Others were left standing on airfields and farms, rusting but unbroken, quiet ghosts of a time when steel curves meant survival. 2 wars, 2 nations, 2 curves of corrugated metal, each telling a different story of ingenuity. Yet their destinies would soon meet on the battlefields of 1944, where both huts, the original and its American descendant, faced the greatest logistical trial of the war. June 1942, the Pacific Ocean. Vast, humid, unforgiving. American Seabees step off landing craft onto raw coral beaches, their boots sinking into mud and salt water. Behind them, cargo ships unload crates stamped with black stencils. Quonset Hut, prefabricated unit Type B. Within hours, the coastline transforms. Steel ribs rise like skeletons under the tropical sun. Men hammer, bolt, and haul, racing against the heat and the threat of air raids. By nightfall, rows of Quonset huts stand where only jungle had been that morning. They become mess halls, operating rooms, and radio posts. This was the battlefield of logistics, and the Quonset Hut was its frontline weapon. As the United States leapt across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Saipan to Okinawa, every new base was marked by those curved silhouettes. They stored ammunition, housed medics, and served as aircraft maintenance bays. Some were even converted into chapels, with crosses hung from the steel ribs. But perfection under laboratory conditions rarely survives the field. The Quonset Hut, born in New England's mild climate, struggled under Pacific extremes. By noon, the interiors were ovens. By night, they became condensation chambers. The zinc coating on steel panels corroded in the salt air. Insects nested in the wooden floors. Soldiers improvised. They cut ventilation holes, elevated huts on stilts, or covered them with palm leaves to shield against the sun. Still, they endured. Their greatest virtue was speed. The Seabees could land on an island and have an operational camp within 48 hours. In that time, Nissen's principle, prefabrication, modularity, portability, had evolved into something colossal. America had turned invention into infrastructure. Yet, in engineering terms, efficiency and elegance had parted ways. The original Nissen design had been perfectly balanced between weight, curvature, and strength. The Quonset, optimized for production, often overused material yet underperformed in resilience. Many units collapsed under typhoon winds, forcing redesigns. The British noted the irony. In 1943, military observers from London visiting U.S. Pacific bases remarked on the Quonset's industrial genius but field impracticality. The huts did their job, but at a cost in comfort, durability, and adaptability. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the Nissen Hut was proving its quiet supremacy once more. In England's fields and along newly built airstrips, Royal Air Force engineers erected thousands of Nissen Huts to house mechanics, pilots, and radar operators. They withstood winter storms that ripped canvas hangars apart. They stayed dry, stable, and cheap. On D-Day's eve, British camps across southern England gleamed with the metallic arcs of Nissen Huts, silent witnesses to the preparations for the invasion of Europe. When Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, those same huts followed them. Prefabricated kits were ferried across the Channel, erected within days near forward airfields and supply depots. The curved roofs that had once shielded soldiers in Flanders mud now stood among the hedgerows of France. In that moment, 2 evolutions of the same idea, the Nissen and the Quonset, were serving side by side in the world's largest military operation. Both performed their duty, but their differences grew stark. The British Nissen Hut endured bombardments and heavy rain with minimal maintenance. The American Quonset, while easier to assemble, often demanded constant repairs in the rough European weather. And yet, neither nation abandoned them. They had become too essential, too symbolic. The huts were not just shelters. They were extensions of military identity, curved reflections of two empires waging total war. But as 1944 turned to 1945, the contrast would reach its peak. In the freezing, chaotic push into Germany and the hellish, typhoon-swept islands of the Pacific. Two wars, two climates, two designs, both racing toward victory. One built for precision, the other for production. Only one would leave a legacy of engineering brilliance. Winter 1944. Europe was burning again. From Normandy's cold beaches to the frozen Ardennes, Allied troops fought through towns reduced to rubble. In this chaos, the Nissen Hut became the quiet miracle of the advance, a mobile architecture of war. On hastily captured airstrips, Royal Engineers unloaded crates marked Nissen Type 1636. Within hours, curved ribs rose from the frost. These huts became field hospitals for the wounded, radar centers for the Royal Air Force, and command posts for Montgomery's staff. They were efficient, quick, and reliable. The same virtues that had defined them in 1916, British engineers loved them for another reason: adaptability. Need a longer hut? Bolt two together. Want insulation? Add sandbags and boards. The Nissen was a system, not just a structure. When snow fell over Belgium in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the huts held firm. American engineers nearby, now veterans of the Quonset system, noted how the British design resisted collapse under weight that crushed other shelters. The curved geometry distributed pressure evenly, where the Quonset's broader arch bent and creaked. Reports from Royal Engineers that winter praised the Nissen's endurance as virtually bomb-proof to near misses, a remarkable claim, yet one repeated across multiple units. They withstood wind, snow, and shockwaves without structural failure. At the same time, across the Pacific, the Quonset Hut was reaching its own test of survival. On Okinawa in 1945, torrential rain and typhoon winds slammed into U.S. bases. Thousands of Quonset huts lined the muddy hillsides, hospitals, storage depots, and command offices. When Typhoon Louise hit in October, winds exceeding 120 miles per hour ripped through the island. Hundreds of Quonsets collapsed or lost their roofs entirely. The aftermath was devastating. Tons of supplies destroyed, shelters flattened, and communications paralyzed for days. Investigations followed. U.S. Navy engineers concluded that the shallow curve and lightweight framing, ideal for rapid deployment, lacked the structural resilience for such extreme environments. Field modifications, stronger anchoring, reinforced ribs were introduced too late. But there was no denying the achievement. These huts had allowed the American war machine to exist where no permanent structures could. On coral, jungle, and volcanic rock, they provided a foothold for every operation. Without them, forward bases would have taken months, not days, to establish. Still, by war's end, the contrast was clear. The Nissen Hut remained a design of balance and endurance, nearly unchanged since its invention 3 decades earlier. The Quonset, despite its vast production, required continuous adaptation. Multiple models, T-rib, P-rib, Quonset redesign A and B tried to fix its flaws, but never matched the Nissen's fundamental harmony of form and function. Even American field officers admitted the difference. In a 1945 engineering review, one colonel noted, "The British hut stands where ours sweats and bends. We build for numbers. They build for need." It wasn't criticism. It was observation, a truth of two industrial philosophies colliding under wartime pressure. Yet both designs, in their success and imperfection, defined the shape of modern military logistics. They blurred the line between battlefield and home, between soldier and builder. In a way, the curve became a symbol of the entire Allied effort. Different nations, different strengths, bending toward one goal. By May 1945, as the guns fell silent in Europe and the Pacific burned toward its brutal end, millions of soldiers found themselves in identical arcs of steel. Inside those huts, letters were written, wounds healed, friendships forged, and futures imagined. The Nissen Hut had proven its brilliance, a design so pure it needed no reinvention. The Quonset had proven America's unmatched capacity for scale and adaptation. Together, they had sheltered empires through the storm, and when peace finally came, both huts would face their final transformation, from weapons of war to instruments of recovery. August 1945. The world exhaled. The guns were silent. Cities lay in ruins. From Coventry to Cologne, from Manila to Tokyo, millions of people were without homes, hospitals, or hope. Yet scattered across the landscape were thousands upon thousands of curved metal huts, relics of a war that had changed everything. The Nissen and Quonset Huts had fulfilled their wartime purpose. Now they were reborn. In Britain, the Ministry of Works faced a monumental crisis. The Blitz had destroyed nearly 500,000 homes. With factories idle and labor short, the government turned once again to Nissen's humble invention. Thousands of huts were repurposed into temporary housing. Families moved into structures originally meant for soldiers. Corrugated iron walls were lined with plasterboard, windows added, and stoves replaced by small fireplaces. It was modest, but it was shelter. Across the bombed cities of England, children grew up in Nissen homes, calling them tin palaces. They were cold in winter, hot in summer, but for many, they represented a small victory over destruction. A British journalist wrote in 1946, "They were born for war, but live for peace." Meanwhile, in the United States, the transformation took on an entirely different character. America had emerged from the war industrially unbroken, but with mountains of surplus. Over 150,000 Quonset huts sat unused in depots and naval yards. The War Assets Administration began selling them to civilians, cheap, practical, and available by mail order. Farmers bought them for barns and workshops. Colleges used them for dormitories and classrooms during the post-war enrollment boom. In New York, veterans' families lived in Quonset villages built on former military land. On the West Coast, some became diners, dance halls, even churches. The hut had transcended its military birth. It became part of everyday America, a symbol of the new middle-class optimism born from wartime industry. Yet, the irony remained. What had begun as a British design for survival became an American icon of prosperity. Across the Pacific, the story was harsher. In Japan, the Philippines, and Korea, captured or abandoned Quonset huts became emergency housing. Refugees, orphans, and displaced families took shelter beneath their rusting arcs. The same corrugated shells that once housed invading armies now sheltered the defeated and dispossessed. In Europe, the Nissen Hut's legacy endured quietly. British bases across occupied Germany remained lined with them for years after the war. They served as mess halls for occupation forces, repair shops for tanks, and temporary offices for reconstruction authorities. Many stood untouched into the 1950s, weathered, dented, but still functional. And yet, despite their usefulness, both designs carried the mark of transience. They were never meant to last forever. Corrugated iron rusted, floors decayed, and insulation wore thin. By the late 1950s, governments across the West began dismantling or replacing them with permanent structures. Still, not all disappeared. Some Nissen huts became chapels, scout halls, and community centers. Their simplicity made them endlessly adaptable. Others remained on farms and rural airfields, quietly serving through the decades. In the United States, Quonset huts lingered even longer. Their curved silhouettes dotted the landscape from Alaska to Florida. Artists converted them into studios. Small towns turned them into gyms or town halls. They became nostalgic symbols of wartime unity, functional, unpretentious, and enduring. The war had ended, but the huts refused to die. They had evolved beyond their creators. Imaginations, from emergency shelters to icons of resilience. But their persistence raised a deeper question. What do we keep when war is over? The machines, the monuments, or the ideas behind them? Because behind every Nissen and every Quonset lay a single principle that defined the 20th century, that design could be both weapon and salvation. By the early 1950s, the curved silhouettes of Nissen and Quonset huts had become global landmarks, echoes of war now serving a world learning how to rebuild. From the ruins of Europe to the frontiers of the Pacific, they stood as proof that good engineering could outlive its battlefield. In Britain, the Nissen hut's post-war life was understated but profound. Thousands still stood on Royal Air Force bases, quietly housing new generations of airmen during the Cold War. Others became temporary schools, their walls lined with chalkboards and children's laughter replacing the sound of artillery. In remote Scottish towns, Nissen huts became community halls. On English farms, they turned into machine sheds and workshops, still doing their job decades later. Simple, sturdy, uncomplaining. Architects began to take notice. The hut's minimalist beauty, its honest geometry and absence of excess, inspired post-war modernists. Its design principles found their way into prefabricated housing and industrial architecture across Europe. For the first time, military design had crossed into the civilian world not as ruin, but as reference. Yet, the Quonset hut's legacy followed a different path, one shaped by America's culture of reinvention. Across the United States, they became emblems of possibility. Veterans' families raised children under their curved roofs. Universities like Harvard and MIT used them as overflow classrooms during the GI Bill boom. Entire neighborhoods of Quonset homes sprang up in California, Oregon, and New York. Steel half-moons filled with life and optimism. The design even spread beyond America. Modified Quonset huts appeared in Canada, the Philippines, Australia, and South Korea. Wherever U.S. influence reached, the curved shell followed. It became a universal symbol of American practicality, the shape of the temporary forever. But time is merciless to steel and wood. By the 1970s, rust and decay claimed most of the originals. Many were dismantled, sold for scrap, or simply left to collapse under their own weight. Only a few survived, preserved as museums or heritage structures, silent monuments to an age of ingenuity under fire. Still, their influence endured in modern prefabricated architecture. The concept of rapid deployable shelters, modular assembly, and flat-pack construction all trace their lineage to the huts of Nissen and Quonset. Their DNA lives on in disaster relief housing, mobile field hospitals, and even space habitat prototypes. In both Britain and America, these curved structures came to symbolize two different versions of progress. For Britain, the Nissen hut represented precision, restraint, and efficiency. Design born from scarcity that achieved elegance through necessity. For America, the Quonset hut represented power, productivity, and ambition. Design born from abundance that achieved greatness through scale. Both were right, in their own way. Both reflected their nation's souls during the defining conflict of the 20th century, and while the Quonset's numbers dwarfed the Nissens' millions, Built versus tens of thousands, it was the British design that engineers continued to study for its structural perfection. Nissen's original curve, calculated by hand with slide rules and compasses in 1916, still stands as one of the most mathematically efficient uses of steel ever created for architecture. A century later, some of those very huts still exist, rusted, patched, but standing. In the quiet corners of England and the wind-swept bases of Iceland, their arches still rise against the sky, unbent by time. They remind us that true genius isn't always loud. Sometimes it's curved, humble, and built by soldiers in the mud. The war was long over. But the lesson those two huts carried, that simplicity is strength, and necessity is the mother of invention, would shape architecture, logistics, and engineering for generations. And so, from the frozen fields of Flanders to the sunburned shores of the Pacific, the story of two huts ends not in ruin, but in endurance. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of war. What once began as desperate improvisation, steel sheets curved against the cold and rain, has become a quiet symbol of human resilience. The Nissen Hut and its American descendant, the Quonset, were never meant to be beautiful. They were meant to work, to stand when men could not, to shelter hope when the world was falling apart. Yet, in their unadorned simplicity, they became something more enduring than any fortress or monument. Each arch of corrugated metal tells a story, of soldiers who slept in its shadow, of engineers who bent physics to necessity, and of ordinary people who later found safety within its frame. From Britain's battered coasts to America's sprawling bases, from desert outposts to island airfields, these structures carried a shared human truth, that innovation is not born from comfort, but from crisis. The Nissen Hut taught the world the value of clarity in design, how elegance could emerge from precision and scarcity. The Quonset Hut taught the world the power of industrial might, how a nation's energy could turn a simple idea into a global force. Together, they bridged continents and philosophies, proving that good engineering transcends borders. Today, a few still stand, their corrugated walls rusted, their floors warped, their memories intact. They outlasted empires, doctrines, and generals, silent witnesses to a time when civilization itself was under siege. If you walk through one now, the echoes remain, the clatter of boots, the murmur of men writing letters home, the hum of machinery, the rain tapping on curved steel. The war they were built for has long ended, but their story continues, not as relics of destruction, but as monuments to survival. And perhaps that is the truest measure of brilliance, not how long a design shines, but how deeply it endures. Because while America's Quonset Hut became a legend of production, it was Britain's Nissen Hut, born from mud, mathematics, and necessity. That defined the art of functional perfection. It wasn't built to impress, it was built to last. And somehow, a century later, it still does.